Program Director, WRI, Dr. Vivek Vaidyanathan, Dr. Vivek Vaidyanathan, Program Manager, Artha Global, and the panel will be moderated by Kashmira Dubash, Senior Program Manager, ITDP India. After the panel discussion, we'll open the floor for questions and interaction with the audience. So back to the topic. While interacting and working closely with all these cities, we found a need to document LEZ planning process from scratch and create a reference LEZ guidebook for other cities to follow. We were able to simplify and demystify these complex processes into an engaging and illustrated handbook that all stakeholders, including citizens, can comprehend and understand the key aspects of LEZ planning. I would like to invite Varsha, Associate, ITDP India, who has contributed greatly to this publication, to take us through the LEZ basics. Over to you, Varsha.
Thank you so much, Siddhartha. Hello, everyone. I'm Varsha from the comms team at ITDP India. Today, I will be taking you all through our journey about the low emission zones journey in India, and about a little bit about the making of this publication as well. Next, please. Next, please. So our journey began in 2023, early last year, when ITDP India came together with a team at ICCT to meet and strategize the action plan for low emission zones in India. Next slide, please. After this meeting, we dive right in to start research about low emission zones already being implemented at various parts of the world. And we brought together these learnings from different case studies and on-ground research, and compiled the best learnings from these practices around the world. These included London, Seoul, Paris, Antwerp, etc. And all of these were compiled to inform our research going forward. Next, please. But as a step to introduce LEZs in Indian cities, we needed to get the cities invested in the idea. And so we had developed a research framework and a methodology, and we presented it as a starting point to 3 cities in India, with Pune, Pimpri-Chinchwad, and Chhatrapati Sambhajinagar as the primary cities of intervention. Next, please. Following this meeting, we also started on-ground surveys, which included vehicle emission surveys, which were more than 5,000 in number, across different petrol stations and parking lots in these 3 cities, Pune, Pimpri-Chinchwad, and Chhatrapati Sambhajinagar. This was done to estimate the proportion of the types of vehicle engines in use in order to inform the LEZ strategy in these cities. Next, please. Alongside this on-ground survey, we were also using our data-driven approach in order to identify priority areas to implement LEZs in these 3 cities. Next, please. So our findings from the roadmap that we developed with all the short-term and long-term action plans revealed that a significant reduction, more than 81%, is possible for particulate matter emissions, and also a significant reduction in carbon dioxide emissions through the different LEZ scenarios. Next, please. And we immediately took these scenarios to the different cities that we had identified. And we also introduced this to various stakeholders, such as traffic police, pollution control boards, environment boards, and transport offices in all these cities. Next, please. One of the biggest wins from this journey is how the LEZ implementation was integrated with the graded response action plan in Pimpri-Chinchwad by closely working with the City Transformation Office in Pimpri-Chinchwad. And with all these research, we were primed with every single aspect of knowledge that was required for implementing low emission zones in India. Next, please. There's a quote by Martin Fisher that says that knowledge is the process of piling up facts, but wisdom lies in their simplification. And we have always followed this practice at ITDP and aimed at creating such publications that simplified complex processes and projects such as congestion pricing basics, footpath fix, parking basics, and e-bus basics, and even through infographics such as the 10 things that make a healthy streets. And we wanted to create something similar for low emission zones as well. Next, please. We were guided by 4 primary principles in order to make the vision of low emission zones accessible to everyone. This was coherence, values, clarity, and correctness. We had to adapt the context to India's context. We also wanted to break down complex ideas with graphics and very straightforward knowledge that was accessible to all kinds of people. We also ensured that the visuals and narratives we developed always represented diverse stakeholders. And we were also very diligent in getting the details right by ensuring data and information is accurately represented. Next, please. Over a course of multiple iterations and outlines, the LEZ Basics publication today gives clear, simple, and practical guidance for cities interested in implementing LEZs. Next, please. We aspired to create a message of hope through this publication, that it is possible to go from this, a pollution-ridden world today, to a cleaner future that was friendly for every single generation to come, and also exactly how to get to that scenario as well. Next, please. And through this process, we also created a new member in the ITDP character family called Lester, inspired by the ANPR cameras. And you will be able to see this character making an appearance in all our outreach going forward too. Next, please. So this publication will not be possible without the hard work of multiple people involved. And on behalf of ITDP, we would like to thank the technical research team from both ITDP and ICCT, whose on-ground research and expertise informed the spine and formed the spine of the publication itself. And the publication production team, which simplified the ideas and made it accessible. And the reviewers whose targeted inputs elevated the quality of the publication greatly. So now, without much further ado, we'd like to present the low emission zone basics. Next, please. And we present the illustrated guide with all our learnings and insights from over a year's worth of research, consultation, and dialogue. This publication sets the context for the concept itself. It simplifies the concept and gives different strategies present in the concept itself, and also offers step-by-step guidance for the cities itself. I would like to take you all through a video that explains a bit more about the publication. After the video, I request Angi and Donita to share the early access for the publication with all the guests here.
Sure. We can't hear the video.
Hear the audio of this video. So that maybe do you want to try to present?
I can try, yes.
Thank you.
Air is life's most basic need, and ensuring that it's clean is an act of love for ourselves and our cities. But the air we breathe in many Indian cities ranks among the worst in the world. Urban road transport, including all the cars, buses, two-wheelers you see on our streets, is the fastest growing source of emissions in India, becoming a major contributor to air pollution. Indian cities have started taking some steps towards addressing this problem by initiating improvements to public transport and shifting to electric vehicles backed with policies and schemes. But despite this, we continue to breathe toxic air as pollution levels don't seem to reduce. So what can we do? Enter low emission zones, or LEZs, a powerful strategy for cities to restrict the use of polluting vehicles, reduce tailpipe emissions, and accelerate shift to cleaner vehicles. When planned alongside complementary measures such as improved public transport and better walking and cycling infrastructure, LEZs can encourage that shift and lead to vibrant urban environments with fresh air and improved public health. To plan LEZs, cities can use data to make decisions on which vehicles to restrict, the right areas for interventions, and complementary measures based on extensive studies and surveys. Successful implementation also depends on choosing the right enforcement council, engaging with the community to build support, and constantly monitoring progress. ITDP India's latest publication, LEZ Basics, gives insights into the nuts and bolts of this bold idea. It also provides step-by-step guidance for Indian cities to strategize, plan, and implement low-emission zones. Together, let us make India's air clean again for ourselves, our cities, and the future generations to come. Join us on our journey towards clean air, healthy streets, and happier cities.
Thank you so much, Siddharth. So that officially marks the launch of the LEZ publication. I request everyone with a physical copy of the publication to turn on their cameras and pose with it for a photo op for the launch, marking the launch itself. Okay. You can all access the publication through the links that will be shared in the chat box. And I would like to pass it over back to Siddhartha for the other sessions.
Yeah. Thank you, Varsha. I'm sure LEZ Basics would be a front runner and a key guidance document for city agencies and stakeholders to ideate and plan low emission zones in their cities. Now, to delve deep into the topic of today's discussion, the role of national and state governments in making low emission zones successful, I would like to welcome our esteemed panel and hand over the reins to Kashmira. Over to you, Kashmira.
Thank you very much, Siddhartha. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all for today's webinar, where we are joined by our outstanding panel of experts to discuss this very transformative pathways for low emission zones in India. A very warm welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time out, Mr. Shashi Verma, Dr. Anju Goyal, Dr. Vivek Vaidyanathan, Parin Visaria, Dr. Sandra Woppelhorst, and Mr. Sri Kumar Kumaraswamy. We're thrilled to have each of you share your insights on this very critical topic. Now, as a mother, I often think about the quality of air that my kids breathe and the cities that they will grow up in. And I think some of you might be able to resonate with me. It is worrisome. And we've been bombarded very lately with news on worsening air quality in cities like Delhi, Mumbai, and it's upsetting. While it's upsetting, sadly enough, it is not surprising. So we are here today to discuss one such solution, low emission zones. And we at ITDP are trying to grapple with what low emission zones actually mean and simplify this particular concept. So here is an analogy. Just like weight loss often requires a calorie deficit by cutting out high calorie foods, cities could potentially use a pollution deficit too by restricting high emission vehicles. So low emission zones act like this diet for city air, letting in only the cleaner vehicles to help reduce pollution and create healthier urban spaces. Do let us know whether this sort of an analogy actually resonates with you. But cities cannot do it alone. They need the support of states. They need the support of the national government. And so we are here today to discuss what the roles of these various governments are to implement low emission zones successfully in our Indian cities. My first question is to Mr. Shashi Verma, Chief Technology Officer at Transport for London. So London's low emission zones has always been a go-to example for all of us to refer to. We've heard of impactful data on reduction in emissions from the London's Mayor's Report, where London's LEZ, the ultra low emission zone launched in 2019, had actually led to a 44% reduction in nitrogen dioxide levels and roughly 30% decrease in traffic in central areas. So could you share a little bit of London's low emission zone journey, and particularly the kind of support that you received from the UK government that helped you ensure a successful planning and implementation of the low emission zone in India, in London. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Kashmira, and good afternoon, everyone. We have been on a journey of reducing emissions in London for a long time. I think it's important to start by looking at what this overall journey looks like, right? Because it's very easy to get caught up in assuming that the only intervention that's been made is the ultra low emission zone. But actually, there's a long history of interventions in London going back to the 1950s that have cumulatively led to the improvement in air quality. And I think when we look at this in the context of India, it's important to keep that entire journey in mind, because emissions come from multiple sources and they have to be tackled comprehensively if you want to see the improvement in air quality. The reality is that ultra low emission zones as an isolated intervention will only produce a very marginal result. So starting in the 1950s, the banning of burning coal in London led to actually the biggest improvement in air quality. In the 1990s, the clean diesel program reduced emission from diesel vehicles. In the 2000s, we introduced the low emission zone first, the ultra low emission zone later, and the ultra low emission zone has been expanded twice already. So 2019 was the central London zone. In 2021, we expanded it to what we call inner London. And then last year in August, we expanded that to all of London. So it now covers an area of 1,600 square kilometers, which is very similar to the area of Delhi, for example. But it's absolutely critical to keep in mind that all of these interventions have cumulatively produced the results that we see. And one of the biggest interventions that's not talked about, but is absolutely critical in thinking about what happens in India, is the interventions that were made in the early part of the century, which increased the mode share for sustainable modes of travel, walking, cycling, and public transport. So that used to be about 52%, went up to about 63%. It's probably the biggest increase in sustainable travel in any major city in the world. The reality is that if you do an intervention of that kind, you will end up with fewer cars on the road, fewer vehicles on the road, whether they're polluting or not polluting. The fact that there are fewer vehicles on the road is a big intervention by itself. What then happens is that you're then tackling the residual problem, which is that you've tackled all the dirtiest fuels. You've tackled the question of how many vehicles there are on the road. And now it's a question of how can you make the very substantial but incremental improvements in the quality of engines and the quality of emissions that are coming from engines. And that is where the low emission zone in 2008, which applied on heavy vehicles, and the ultra low emission zone that applies on all vehicles, started to make an improvement. So, broadly speaking, the low emission zone came in 2008, applies on any vehicle above a weight of 3 tons. The vehicles had to be Euro 4 compliant back in 2008. With the ultra low emission zone, all vehicles need to be Euro 6 compliant. So any diesel vehicle before 2016, any petrol vehicle before 2006 does not comply. Right? So with the very marginal exemptions for historic vehicles, vehicles that are more than 50 years old, every other vehicle has to be compliant. And it's a very targeted intervention because the problem in London was one of nitrogen oxides. And so you identify the source of the emission and you go after it very directly. And this is, the fundamentals of environmental taxation in economics is that you go right after the source of the externality. And this is what's called a Pigouvian tax. And the whole principle is you try and tax the externality as closely as you can. So that is why the ultra low emission zone came in the form that it did in London. And you cited some numbers there, Kashmir, about the reduction in nitrogen oxide emissions in London. Actually, the reduction in traffic was not because of the ultra low emission zone. That was because of the congestion charge 20 years ago. So again, the point that I'm making here is that it would be a huge mistake for anyone in India to think that all you need to do to improve the air quality is to improve a low emission zone, and that's going to tackle the problem. You have to look carefully at the full suite of all the interventions that have been made in London with a lot of determination. I mean, none of these things are easy, right? But they've been made repeatedly to try and tackle not just the problem of air quality. I mean, that is one very critical thing that we're trying to tackle, but air quality, sustainability, carbon emissions, crowding, quality of life, quality of urban spaces. These are together, comprehensively together. They are the things that make life in a city easier. Now, many of you are a bit younger than me. I'll tell you, growing up in India in the 1970s, 1980s, or even earlier, cities used to be pleasant places to live. They were clean, they were safe, they were pleasant places to live. That is not what cities are today. I mean, the toxicity from multiple angles, air quality being one of the worst, is incredible. And although India has progressed on many fronts, the quality of life that we are offering in cities has not improved at all. In fact, it's gone backwards. So, just out of curiosity, I was looking at the air quality index in Delhi this morning, 686. When you reach a level of 100, you start getting environmental alerts in London. Apart from monsoon days, you don't get to a level under 100 in Delhi ever. So that is the disparity that we see, and it has become normalized in our thinking in the world that that's what it is. When the air is polluted every November, we get this pollution episode. So I think so 2 points here. One, it's great that people are thinking about low emission zones, but it's important to put that into context and look at all the broader interventions that need to be made. The other question that you asked me is, what it took to get this implemented and the role of respective levels of government. So at the outset, I think it's important to say that politically, these things are not easy in the UK. They're not easy anywhere. It takes a lot of effort and courage to implement something of this kind because we've done low emission zones with charging schemes, which basically means that if you have a polluting vehicle, you end up paying. And the one thing that we know is people don't like paying a new charge. So the introduction of any of these things, whether it's the congestion charge or the low emission zone or the ultra low emission zone, has been a politically challenging exercise in London as well. In the UK, the way things work is the mayor has very broad powers to introduce these policies. The powers come from national government, they come from parliament. The government has to set up the whole legislative framework, and actually it's the national government that has to sign off on the charging order, the scheme order, that allows us to put a charging mechanism in place for the ultra low emission zone. But the political decision is very much the mayor's, and the person who's politically exposed to it is very much the mayor. And for the last 8 years, we had a mayor and government of opposing parties, and that did not make life easy. It meant that something of this kind, which is politically sensitive, does cause a problem. And that's exactly what we saw. Now, the mayor had the determination to go after it despite those political challenges, which is why we've ended up with the implementation of the policy as we have. But let's not for 1 minute think that just because it's the UK and whatever image people might have of the UK, therefore it is easy to implement these things here. There was nothing easy about it. Nothing easy about the policy or the politics or the technology or anything else that we have to put in place here. These are incredibly challenging things, and you have to build political consensus through a very painful and concerted effort. I'll stop there, Kashmira.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for sharing the challenges. And like you mentioned, it's really not easy. But what we've also seen is that many cities now across the UK have actually implemented low emission zones. There are 10 in England, 4 in Scotland. What changed? What changed so that you were able to scale up low emission zones across UK?
So it's not scaling up. I think other people are implementing similar policies, but that's partly because, look, we've left the EU now, but some of the EU mandates are still there. So there was an EU air quality mandate for large cities, which kicked this all off 25 years ago. And unfortunately, sometimes it requires a stick of that kind on your back to get some movement. Now, London was the first one to move only because as a larger city, it was more exposed to that mandate. But across Europe, the reason why low emission zones have been introduced in one form or the other. I mean, not all are charging schemes. If you go to Spain and other places, they've been implemented very differently, right? In some places, they've just outright banned certain vehicles. In some places, areas have been pedestrianized. The form of implementation is different. And again, we shouldn't go just by the example of London just because we've made a certain policy choice. But the broader policy mandate that came from the EU to clean up the air was very critical in getting some movement here.
Thank you for sharing that, sir. And my final question to you is that given the challenges that you have witnessed in London and seen across the UK, we don't mean to replicate that entire model here in India, but from your learnings in the UK, could you maybe share some of your key takeaways from your experience, from your learnings on what actions the national government in India could potentially consider to effectively support cities and states implement low emission zones?
Well, again, I would go broader than low emission zones, and it's what needs to be done to fix air quality, right? And the first thing that I would say is that we've been very evidence based. So you look at where the emissions are coming from, you look at what types of emissions are exceeding limits, and you go after them very directly. And that kind of work has to be done in India as well. And as we know very well, the whole Gangetic Plains has a very kind of unique environmental set of factors that require a very specific intervention. Everywhere else, it's a very different set of factors. But one of the things, I mean, this is my favorite gripe about debates on air quality in India. One of the things that gets talked about not enough is the fact that roads are dirty and the entrained dust from roads is one of the principal causes of air pollution in India. When you go back to the pandemic, air got clean in days because there were no vehicles running. And that's not because of tailpipe emissions. It's because the roads were not being disturbed. And so I think, when you start looking at what mandates the central government needs to give, or indeed what interventions are made at local levels, all of these factors come into account. As I said, with the Gangetic Plains, it's a very unique challenge in the sense that there is transported pollutants where local interventions have, there are limits to the effectiveness of local interventions just because you could be very good in your local area, but transported pollutants mean that, and I'm not talking about crop burning alone, and transported pollutants could be anything. It could mean that your interventions are not very effective. Other places, local interventions work. So I think, if I was to draw out some things from our experience, the first is be evidence driven. Go after all sources of pollutants, not just the one that catches your fancy today, and use the widest possible toolkit, not just the introduction of low emission zones, but use every tool that's available to you. I'm an advocate of public transport. We will never stop advocating it. I think half this problem gets solved if we had better public transport.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Shashi Verma, for sharing your insights. And you made a very valid point about this needs to be a very evidence-driven approach. And then now this brings me to my next speaker, Parin Visaria, Deputy Manager, ITDP India. Parin, ITDP India, along with ICCT, has been working on low emission zones since 2023, and specifically on planning and strategizing in Pimpri-Chinchwad, Pune, and Chhatrapati Sambhaji Nagar. Now, we'd also like to understand a little bit from you on your perspective. You've been working very closely with these cities. I think maybe you could share a little bit about how this too was, in many ways, an evidence-driven approach to this particular project. But also, beyond that, what we've also heard from the cities is that they do require state support. They do require changes to be made at the national government to advance their efforts. Could you share a little more about ITDP India and ICCT's journey on low emission zones, and how do we scale up these efforts in these cities with the support of the state and the national government? Over to you, Parin.
Thank you, Kashmira. So just for context, I'll speak about Pimpri-Chinchwad because that's the city which has taken one step ahead towards figuring out how to implement low emission zone. Just for context, the whole of city the entire municipal corporation limit in Pimpri-Chinchwad right now, as per their graded response action plan, is a low emission zone, roughly an area of about 180 square kilometers. In terms of discouraging the use of polluting vehicles, the city has said we will be discouraging pre-BS4, BS3, BS2, BS1, equivalent of Euro 1 to 3, and pre-BS, roughly the year being pre-2010 vehicles. Again, within these vehicles, it's mainly targeted towards not only light and heavy goods vehicles, but also light motor vehicles, personal cars, and also two-wheelers. So these four segments are right now what they are targeting. The reason being because the city in its study saw that 85% of the pollution, majorly PM emissions, even NOx, also carbon dioxide emissions, are coming from largely these segments of vehicles. Also mainly from two-wheelers, personal vehicles, is LMVs, is because also their volumes are quite high in the city. Now, while the city has embedded this into the graded response action plan, now the next question comes in that how do we make this possible in terms of legality? And the second thing, in terms of enforcement, how do we make this possible? And when I say enforcement, it's not only just the technology, but also administratively, how do we make this possible? So giving you certain examples, when I talk about administratively, how we can make it possible, there is definitely a big role for traffic police and RTO to play here in enforcement. While the city has decided on the fines, not fines, but environment protection charge. So in like London, the city has not gone towards an outright ban. They will basically still allow these vehicles to run in, but they have to pay a daily environment protection charge somewhere between 100 to 750 rupees a day. And now, while the city has decided onto these rates, but then how do you fine it? And there is certainly a role that traffic police RTO need to play. But before that, within their system, there needs to be an introduction of the violation that if you enter a low emission zone, and if you're not these if you're a non-compliant vehicle, you will be basically fined. So right now there is no provision of it in the through the transport department. So again, these systematic changes needs to be made for the city to be able to enforce it. The second thing also, the declaration of no low emission zone. While city has said, okay, this is a low emission zone, there needs to be also some state approvals or a notification to say that this is now a low emission zone. So again, these are things which is something which we are figuring out as we are working with the city on implementation. Also, as Mr. Sashi said, it's not just about restricting vehicles, but there is a whole ecosystem of even complementary interventions needed. So in all these three cities, we saw that even a basic public transport system is not well connected. There is a lot to be upgraded there. So in fact, the city is also interested in to see how they can get more and more buses so that they can deploy it faster. They can at the same time upgrade its public transport connectivity while the metro is getting developed. So even the quantum of buses that is required, the city is looking how the state government can also help in those. So then the low emission zone can be made possible. So these are some things which, as we are working with the city, we are figuring out how it's a lot dependent also on state. While it's led by the city government, there is quite a bit that the state has a role to play. Also with data sharing for enforcement, registration here, BS fuel norms. So a lot of it needs to come from the state government on that.
Thanks a lot, Parin. And I will come back to you to talk about a little more about the state level intervention. But I do want to hop over to Dr. Vivek, the program manager at Artha Global, because they had a slightly different approach, right? So while ITDP and ICT worked on LEZ from the city's a city level approach, I think Artha looked at it from a state level approach. So Vivek, so Artha partnered with the Andhra Pradesh Pollution Control Board, which is a state level agency, to kickstart low emission zone initiatives. Now, how, what are the advantages that you see of initiating this conversation with a state level agency as compared to directly working with the cities? So, what were some of the key outcomes of your work of working directly with Andhra Pradesh? And did you face any certain challenges? Did you have any learnings to share? So, if you can just share that, Vivek, that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks, Kashmira, and thanks for ITDP and ICCT for putting together. I'd also just like to say that we're very grateful that we are also partnering with Transport for London as well as TERI. So in fact, we had a national conference last year where Shashi was kind enough to attend, and he gave, I think, in fact, one of the things that the fact that Shashi came down from he was an Indian who has international experience and came down and spoke to the folks in Andhra Pradesh also gave them a lot of confidence. And TERI is, of course, anchoring the technical aspects. In fact, Dr. Anju and her team are we're working very closely with them. So many thanks to both of them and the respective organizations. So our thing, I'll just cut to the chase. I think our focus on going with the state government agency was that because in many ways, going at that level gives a good oversight in terms of what are the initiatives under NCAP, the National Clean Air Program, which are being undertaken. Andhra Pradesh has about 13 non-attainment cities. So it also helped us understand what are the top 3 cities, and that's the bandwidth we had in terms of the cities which we could look at. Finally, we ended up looking at 2 cities, but essentially got a good oversight in terms of what are the initiatives which have been taken. You have consultants, appointed by the Central Pollution Control Board sitting in the municipal corporation office of almost every major city in Andhra Pradesh. So there's a good coordination between the Pollution Control Board and the city agencies, the urban local bodies, the municipal corporations. So I think that was a good way for us. And honestly, wherever we go with most of us, you really need a champion, a civil servant whom we can go with. So in our case, it just so happened that we had a person who really was heading the the Andhra Pollution Control Board, whom we worked with quite closely, Dr. Sameer Sharma, and he was quite instrumental in getting this thing off the ground. But I think once we started working with them, it also helped as a good entry point working with cities. And then once we had this national workshop, we had a series of stakeholder consultations with cities, with the urban local bodies. It brought us, I would say, it brought us a fair bit of goodwill in terms of understanding what it is. Also, one needs to understand that something like this can't be seen in a threatening manner. So you really need to place. So the way we also looked at it is in terms of looking at even calling this as clean air zone, saying that okay, there's a focus on health, there's a focus on improving the health of vulnerable communities. And I've said this in the past, and I think even this has been mentioned by different folks as well, that if you talk about sensitive areas, and this has been mentioned by Shashi as well, in terms of schools, hospitals, let's say places of worship, these places are impacted quite negatively on account of air pollution, and you have vulnerable groups like children, senior citizens, patients, who are impacted for no fault of theirs. So even some of the approaches which we have taken, some of the locations which we have chosen are the sensitive locations where pollution is an issue, and that actually has worked quite well in convincing the city authorities to take this up, or at least to support this in terms of where we are currently. So we are currently working with Vijayawada and Visakhapatnam. And what I must say and appreciate about both these cities is these are, fairly smaller cities. A lot of attention goes to the bigger cities, but both these cities have dedicated urban units with urban experts, and they understand the problem. Some of the bigger cities, they're spoiled for choices. These folks are doing a lot of things. So we have worked very closely while we work with the top management, the municipal commissioners, etc. We work with this core of urban experts who have been at in spite of the change in political leadership in Andhra Pradesh, changes in bureaucratic this thing, these folks have been there and they support us, and I think that is key in ensuring that um, um, any project, or not just about clean air zones or anything, but generally the work which is done is successful. You need that buy-in from that, let's say that middle cadre, who will be there to implement, uh, so that's one thing. And the other thing which is there is we have not tried to position this as something new. This has dovetailed very well into existing initiatives by both these cities. So in Visakhapatnam, you have the something called as the Eco Vizag project. So so this dovetails very well into that, and they have a budget for that as well. And in Vijayawada, similarly, they have existing programs which focus on air pollution. In fact, they have something called as a Swachh Andhra Corporation, a separate entity focused on cleaning Andhra Pradesh. So this dovetails very beautifully with existing initiatives and not competing with them, or kind of showing them that, look, we are working with you, we're there to support your existing initiatives, is the way to move ahead. Obviously, there are certain challenges in terms of I wouldn't say challenges, but the pace at which government works, and they'd like to show impact quickly, but at the same time, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things. But I think that we all face that. So as of now, we are engaged. We are at a stage where we're conducting studies to kind of at these locations to make a case for clean air zones. And I'd just like to end by saying that two of the things which, I mean, what you guys have done very beautifully is come up with this, this publication with a good communication strategy, which becomes very, very crucial. And I think what we also need to look at is the business case. I think making a positive business case, either adding to revenue or ensuring that we were at that conference by WRI, right, where they said a low emission zone cannot be a low economic zone, and that really has stuck with me. So I think when these are things which stick with you, and you either need to add to the revenue, ensure that businesses are not affected, and I think that's key. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivek. So just very quickly, if there was that one thing that you could share, one key insight that if another state, for example, let's take, for example, Maharashtra was to adopt a very similar approach, especially when it comes to collaborating with the Pollution Control Board on low emission zones, what would it be? And following that, Parin, if you could just, because y'all are also working with the state of Maharashtra, if you could share whether some of this could resonate or some of this could be replicated in Maharashtra from your discussions with the state. Vivek, over to you.
Sure. So I think, what worked for us may not necessarily, because different regions have different strategies. In our case, it's just that, I mean, I must say this, that even though we started off with the Pollution Control Board, in many ways, ownership of this has been taken over by the cities, So having the Pollution Control Board is a good entry point. We are keeping them in the loop. We obviously, kind of go back to them, appraise them. They are part of the discussions, etc. But I think in many ways the ownership of these initiatives have now been taken over by cities. So I think what the Pollution Control Board can do is probably enact some of the laws, whether and I'm not the best person to talk about regulations, but I think it can talk at a statewide level. It can certainly bring out certain regulations which which can apply to, let's say, all the 13 non-attainment cities, especially in Andhra Pradesh. But I think it's very it depends from state to state, quite honestly. And the thing for any other state, so we are also trying to work with a few other cities, is what we realize is if you work with tier 2 and tier 3 cities, you're more likely to get a good response, because they're doing a lot of work. Unfortunately, they don't have much capacity. So if you work with them on existing initiatives, that's a good way to go forward, I suspect. Thank you.
Kashmira, can I? Yeah. Just building upon Vivek's point. So state government, Maharashtra, right now, Environment Department, are open to doing this. So there is interest in that. Also they see this some sense relevance of this in the climate action plan, which we hope to hear more from Shri on that. There has been an interest. as Vivek rightly said, it's eventually how the city is driving and how city is taking it forward. That's more important. But at the same time, state government is also, apart from legal aspects, also wanting to facilitate the discussions between different departments, which is very important, bringing them together to make this happen. So that's facilitating that change in the cities is something what state is also open to doing, supporting on that.
Thank you, Parin. So we've got a great understanding from Andhra Pradesh, a little bit of understanding of what's been happening in Maharashtra. So my next question is for Dr. Anju Goel. So Anju, in Pimpri Chinchwad, Pune, we did find that the average annual PM 2.5 levels actually exceeded recommended limits across the city, which made a citywide low emission zone very necessary. But in Terry, what we've been reading is that there is an advocacy for airshed approach, which addresses pollution on a much larger scale beyond the city limits. And you've been working with the Uttar Pradesh State Environment Department on their clean air management plan, which takes a very regional approach by addressing the Indo-Gigantic plain covering 8 states. So maybe can you share a little more about such an approach and how do you implement with the state support a region-wide low emission zone?
Hi, Kashmira. Thanks for asking this question. Kashmira, when you talk about air quality, be it at a city scale, be it at a state scale, or be it at a regional scale, normally it consists of 3 components. The one is like a regional background, the other one is like a urban background, and the third component is actually being contributed by the sources. So when we talk about regional airshed approach, so it basically talks about an area which behaves where the meteorology behaves in a similar manner in an area. That is why the airflow, the patterns of the airflow are the same, and that particular area experiences the same problem of the air pollution. Right. So when you talk about strategies, so definitely, if an area is exceeding, the whole area is exceeding PM 2.5 or PM 10 levels. So first of all, it is very much important to identify the sources associated with it, be it transportation, be it industries, be it, domestic biomass burning. Because when you talk about regional scale, the priority of the sources also changes from your study domain. At a city scale, your transportation might be one of the major sources that is contributing to a problem of air pollution. But at a regional scale, since you're considering the rural areas as well, so the problem of a pollution pertaining to the rural areas also start playing role in the regional background concentration. So normally there in the domestic biomass burning comes out as one of the major source of pollution. And when the things are happening at a regional scale, so the strategies need to be applied. Similar strategies need to be applied throughout the region. So we normally do not call the whole region as a LEZ, because LEZ are normally being specified as a smaller identified hotspot areas within the city domain, which are specifically having transport related emissions, wherein the specific strategies related to the transportation can be implied. For example, as Vivek has mentioned, like we are working with Artha Global in Andhra on 2 cities. So while having looked at the city air quality profile, so what we found that in Vijayawada, though the PM 2.5 and the PM 10 levels were well within the national ambient air quality standards all the time. But if we look into the spatial variation and try to analyze the AOD data for the last 5 years, but we found that there were certain hotspots, the certain pockets of a pollution were there, and those were very much near the traffic intersections, wherein the values of the PM 2.5, annual average values of PM 2.5 are not being met. So these sort of areas can probably be considered as an LEZ. While looking at the overall Vijayawada as a city, what we could observe that, a lot of older vehicles were plying. So in order to mitigate transport-related emissions in a city, so a strategy can be applied on the restricting the age of the vehicle or the fleet modernization. These sort of strategies can be applied at a city-wide, at a district-wide scale. while some specific restriction can be applied at the hotspot pockets which were being identified.
Thanks, Anju. So then that sort of brings me to the next question. Does this change the equation of how cities or states can access financing to implement some of these strategies? So could if to reduce emission in a particular area falls outside the direct control of a city corporation, what kind of access to financing can actually happen, and what is the role of NCAP funds in this?
Absolutely, Kashmira. Currently NCAP funding goes to the urban local bodies. Their main focus is it's basically city centric. So that is why the transportation, the road dust are coming out to be the major sources of pollution. When you talk about the rural areas, then the state authorities needs to pitch in. And it's not only the direct funding under NCAP, because when we were preparing the DPR for UP Camp project, what we realized that the budget, the loan amount that the UP government is taking from the World Bank is not sufficient to implement all the solutions which should be there for all the sectors. Rather, they were able to do only the pilots in the specific sectors. So, which clearly indicated that, only NCAP is not going to solve the problem. Secondly, if you look into the other government central and the state level schemes, we really need to see how the funds can be leveraged from those state and the city level, from the state and the central level schemes in order to tackle the sources of pollution which are outside the city domain and which do not fall under the NCAP. The third thing is the leveraging finance. When we talk about, we also really need to look into the carbon finance, because the sources which are falling outside the city boundaries, for example, even if you look into the national inventories, clean cooking comes out to be one of the major sources of pollution. And the ideal solution should be the access to the LPG or PNG, which is going to happen, but it's going to take time because of the so many constraints related to the supply chain issues, related to affordability issues, and so on. So the intermediary solution always comes switching to the biogas or switching to the cleaner cooking technologies. And since all these technologies are also associated with meeting many of the SDGs, so they do come under the carbon financing domain. And a lot of financing can be leveraged through the carbon markets. So that also needs to take into account. So overall financing is quite a complicated and a complex issue, and only NCAP and leveraging funding from the NCAP is not going to solve the problem. One really need to look into the multiple sources and how all these sources can be integrated in order to put forward the solution. So that needs to be taken into account.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anju, for sharing that. I do have a question on investment and funding for actually Shri Kumar now. But before we get into that, Shri Kumar, WRI has been working very closely with the Maharashtra State Environment Department on climate action plans. Can climate action plans be that entry point to embed low emission zones in cities? Do you have any reflections? Can the state environment department support with facilitating city climate action plans embedded with low emission zones?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. So, in many ways, Maharashtra has been in the forefront of climate action. While simple as that, most of the cities in Maharashtra has quite a, somewhat a functioning environmental department, for example, right? I mean, the state prepares, environmental impact reports, status reports and so on. So, this whole, in terms of climate action, the city of Mumbai has taken is a pioneer in preparing cleaner action, and somewhat that has helped to set a trend for preparing cleaner actions across the country. And now the municipal corporation is also reinventing its structure to have a climate change department, and which will coordinate across the verticals, other departments to prepare actions. Right now it is in the process of identifying actions which can be a mainstream of everyday activity. Therefore, if you look at when we look at all these actions, um, you will see that the source of pollution, which they are trying to address, is of the climate, is almost the same as the source of pollution of clean air related actions. So there is a great potential, and the leadership really identifies that there is a great potential for what you call it, the co-benefits of climate action and clean air action. So this is a very good, recognition. What we see that going forward, in a long term, the carbon emissions. While the carbon emissions is going to take time, reduction is happening. A lot of efforts are happening. It is going to take time, but in a short term, you can demonstrate clean air solutions more quickly, because you can start seeing the differences and so on. So this is somewhat an enthusiasm where when you think about when you act together, right? So in terms of there is a LEZ as a focus in the plans. In the action plans, this number of cities have prepared, and they're also thinking about coming up with pilots and actions and so on. We are also helping to prepare them. Currently, LEZ is not a major idea in many of the city actions, but we do see that there is quite some interest in taking this up, especially the cities are actually, if you see, they're going about their businesses, right? Their everyday problems they're trying to address. More like, say, things like congestion management, things like connecting with the public transport. What happens to the connection to the last mile, connection to the major nodes, like what Anju mentioned about hotspots management. How do we really deal with the complaints which are coming from the ground, which are all related to this. And also there is a good interest in NMT infrastructure and so on. So the point is that what we see that this kind of there is also another important legacy Maharashtra has is these programs like Maji Vasundhara, right? You would have heard about this. It's an excellent example of how the state government innovated in decentralizing the climate action across the state within the smallest of the local bodies, right? Or in the smallest of the officers and smallest of the leaders, local leaders could take climate action through their own means in the smallest ticket projects they could implement across the state, and they got recognized, they got some support, and they got recognized by the state government. This kind of model of sourcing innovation from the stakeholders, from the people who are close to the ground, and driving the idea of environment action in such smallest places is an excellent example of how a state government can really play a more facilitating role, and enabling action and enabling the thinking in many more ways. So anyways, so coming down to, yes, Maharashtra right now, this is LEZ is not in a mainstreamed idea in this climate action, but there is a lot of interest because there is a lot of real problems to be solved, and these kind of models and forums do exist, and the experiences do exist in the ecosystem, which need to be leveraged to sort of achieve some of this ends. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Shri. I will come back to you on a finance-related question, but Mr. Shashi Verma does need to leave shortly, and there was a question from the audience. It was by Ashish Sharma from WRI. Sir, if you can just take a minute to answer this particular question. It is, what role can public-private partnerships play in supporting low-emission zone development in India, particularly in addressing the infrastructure challenges of enforcing such zones? And how can we ensure these partnerships are inclusive and sustainable?
That's a very broad question in one regard. Public-private partnerships come in so many different forms. So if I go on our own experience in London, the technology behind all of our enforcement around the congestion charging and the ultra-low emission zone is all done under a public-private partnership type of contract. So that's one form of where a public-private partnership comes in. But actually, there's a very different point around public-private partnerships that's worth bringing out here. One of the things that's seriously missing in India is proper citizen demand for cleaner air. And I find that absolutely bewildering as to why this is not more of a political issue. It's eventually the people who are being affected, but there is not a groundswell of support. I mean, it's wonderful to do seminars and webinars like this, but I don't see this becoming a big point of public debate. And I think that's where the biggest public-private partnership needs to come in, which is public action along with sort of community groups, stakeholder groups, with the private sector, major employers. I mean, this is about the competitiveness of cities. Honestly, why anyone would choose to go and live in Delhi today, I don't know. I would not. And I think so. Public-private partnerships, as I say, come in many different forms, and I think we have to think about this in its broadest possible sense, from the very specific end of technology partnerships and so on to implement something, but also the kind of partnerships that we need to build political support behind taking tough action.
Thank you very much. So that was a very interesting answer to a very interesting question. Now, before you leave, we were actually going to have one question for all the panelists, but because you're meant to leave, I have one last question. It is that, what is that one priority action, just that one priority action that you would like the state or the national government in India to take to enable low emission zones? And it can be wild.
I think, look, setting an enabling legal framework which people can then implement readily is a very big step, because trying to invent the wheel over and over again is not easy. So I think enabling frameworks, and that's true of the UK as well, enabling frameworks at that time, they do take time to go through that kind of central legislative framework. But once that is in place, it becomes easier to do more of a template implementation of these things. So I think that's the one thing I would ask the central government to do. The central government can also, and actually there are programs in place already for this. Better collection, dissemination of data is critical. Although, to be fair, it doesn't take too much data to understand that there is a very big problem. But beyond the fact that the air quality index is 686 in Delhi this morning, understanding the sources of pollution, understanding the transported nature of pollutants, the cross-border transportation of pollutions and all that. I think those are things on which there is a lot more research needed. I mean, the reality is that when you look at the public debate around air pollution, it is still clouded in fog. It is not, the debate is going on right now. It happens every November, isn't it? Oh, it's all because of Diwali, or it's all because of crop burning and all. And that's fundamentally not true, right? The picture is far more complicated than that. And simply saying that it's all because of crop burning in Punjab is a good way of deflecting action and doing nothing. So I think better evidence is something on which the central government can definitely help.
Thank you very much, sir. Legal framework and better evidence-driven approach are key takeaways from you. So on behalf of ITDP and ICCT, I would like to thank you for taking the time out to joining this webinar. Thank you so much.
And I'm sorry, but I have to go and deal with something critical, so unfortunately I have to drop off. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you, sir. So just going back to Shri, you very correctly said that low emission zone is a very long-term strategy. There need to be shorter-term strategies that need to take place. And what we refer to them as is also complementary interventions, such as improving public transport, walking, cycling infrastructure. So from your perspective, what are some innovative ways that cities can access funding for at least the complementary interventions that we do need to see in our cities very urgently as we speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one encouraging scenario what we see, like especially because you asked about how Maharashtra is doing about it and what are the the ecosystem activities happening. So one encouraging thing is the climate budgeting which is happening in Mumbai, and that is also helping to trigger this kind of thinking in the rest of the cities and in the state government, is that you can actually tag the budget to be which can have some impact on the climate. And it's a process of sort of working with the 20 departments across the municipal corporation to really identify which are the budget items which can have a likely impact, and think about how to out of that, how much of that can be really be committed for these kind of action, right? So you are essentially not looking outside for funding. Of course, outside there are this funding, you can always appropriate the national government missions to use it. But you are really looking at your own sources of funding and how to rethink about it to align it to climate related action. Now, if we can use this, how to, it is up to us to think about how this can be realigned for achieving some of the objectives of clean air. So one is for instance, I mean it's tremendous, right? I mean in Mumbai, imagine 32% of Mumbai municipal corporation, which is the richest municipal corporation, has 32% of the fund can be tagged to climate action. And in terms of expenditure, if you see, uh, but unfortunately, there is at the same time, unfortunately, there is also the problem that it's only 3% of that is actually linked to transport related action. So now a lot more work is required on those lines to really think about it. So see, this is also a situation where the roads budget is also the highest, right? You take any typical municipal corporation, you'll see roads budget is also among the highest, right? So then how do we really leverage the regular municipal corporation funding to be able to implement these kind of actions which will create the ecosystem of things, right? And so if end of the day it is about footpaths and it's about having public transport facilities for amenities for it, it's about have a healthy allocation for buying buses and so on. So this is also a specific thing about Mumbai, but then in overall we need to sort of move away from the city centric expectation. That's what we learned from both Mr. Shashi Verma and also Anju also touched upon, is that the state need to really look at this, and we are not going to make that ownership happen, right? We need to make that ownership happen at the state government, because vehicles are going to come from all over the place, and and the regulations related to vehicle and the because it's a very sensitive political issue of restricting vehicles, and so that is one. And then the second is also that this whole need for a airshed oriented approach. We want to really think about only about sources, because it is as a political and the leadership, they will always have this issue that you are only targeting one section of the population or the vehicle owners and so on. So there is a need for a very comprehensive data oriented approach, and to look at how the this can be enforced. I think it is a more the ecosystem of policies, what Mr. Shashi Verma mentioned about a series of events, series of policies keeps happening over a period of time that leads to this kind of situation which is required. Funding doesn't seem to be the biggest issue out of that, right? Maybe buying of buses is one issue which all of the states and cities, they keep struggling on, and rapidly expanding the rail network or the metro network, so that again is also supported by the central government. So probably it is a combination of the policies, creating ecosystem of that, and local action. So beyond Maharashtra, there's also one in another interesting case we are working on in Indore. We have tried to create this whole local level action, and there is a good local level buy-in in implementing low emission zone. What we see is that a coalition oriented approach, creating a system of champions who will want to take this ahead, and along with that aggregated number of experiments, number of efforts nudged based on data, seem to be really helping to make those large decisions. So yes, so both ecosystem of policies at the state and action oriented, more tangible action oriented ones at the local can help to overcome this.
Thanks a lot, Shri. So we're moving on from the issue related to finance and having a policy framework to another issue that has been associated with low emission zones. So my next question is for Dr. Sandra, who's a senior researcher at ICCT. So Sandra, concerns have been raised around the potential for LEZs to exacerbate social and economic inequalities. So can you maybe share one or two examples of how European cities have addressed this equity concern that I think even Vivek had just touched upon?
Yeah, thanks. Social aspects play an important role when planning for implementing low emission zones. And this is also true for European cities that have implemented low emission zones. And I give you an example, and using the capital region, the Brussels capital region, Brussels, the capital city of Belgium. So this is a city of 1.2 million inhabitants, and the low emission zone that was introduced in 2018 covers the entire city. And it's also important to understand which vehicle types are being addressed. So it's cars, it's light commercial vehicles, buses and coaches, and from 2027 also heavy goods vehicles, mopeds and motorbikes. And so Brussels has a gradual plan to restrict these kind of vehicles, to only allow electric vehicles from initially 2035. So this has been postponed by 2 years. But this is one important aspect when we talked about social, to introduce socially balanced or equitable low emission zones, to have this plan so people can plan, or businesses can plan ahead when they purchase new vehicles. There are also exemptions, for example, for people with disabilities. And another important aspect, how equity concerns have been addressed. This is true for Brussels, but also for other cities, that prior to the implementation, there have been like focus group workshops, stakeholder integration, questionnaires, that all these groups that are affected sooner or later by the low emission zone can have their say and raise their concerns. And this is important to understand also the needs and what policy actions at local levels are necessary to address potential inequities. And when we look at Brussels and concrete measures that have been implemented to address equity, so one measure that is addressed for private individuals who live in the Brussels capital region is what is called the Brussels Air Bonus. So this is a mobility budget. When private persons, they register their private car, they can apply for a mobility budget, which is valid for 2 years. And with this mobility budget, they can use public transport, or they can use it for car sharing, bike sharing, so for alternative modes of transportation. And what is also important in terms of social equity, that this budget is dependent on income. So this is merely for private individuals or households in the lower income groups, and also for persons with disabilities. So this is a very targeted approach, so this funding goes to those most in financial needs, the most vulnerable groups. And so this is for private individuals, but there's also funding and support for businesses who want to replace their non-compliant vehicle with a compliant vehicle. And this is also based on the size of the business. So it's not for the larger business. No, it's for micro businesses and smaller business and medium-sized businesses. And the larger the business, the less is the support. So the maximum support, just to give a number, is like 15,000 euros. And there's also funding for repowering a vehicle. So just these two measures show how important it is to address certain target groups, the most vulnerable groups, and also when talking about limited funding, right? That this is really targeted at those in most financial need, private individuals, but also when we talk about businesses. Another example also for Brussels is that they offer a day pass. So for 24 days in a year, people who don't have a zone compliant vehicle can apply for a day pass, which is 35 euros per day. So there are exemptions. There shouldn't be too many exemptions because that lowers the environmental or the air quality benefits. But so these exemptions help to ensure that people who need to drive in the city once in a while, but don't necessarily can switch right away, that they can still enter the city, and for private reasons, but also for businesses. And so what are the lessons, or what are recommendations with focus on this social impact or also social acceptability? I think what is important is to have a clear timeline so people can plan ahead when they have to switch the vehicle or move to other forms of transportation. It is also important, I think that was also addressed, the collaboration with the neighboring areas, because like in Brussels, and that's true also for London, also with the expansion of the ultra low emission zone, that the neighboring regions might be negatively affected. So also to collaborate and match the different policies, because we also have a lot of commuters who need to go in those cities with low emission zones. What I've said is targeted stakeholder consultation before the introduction, but also throughout the process. So when the regulations or restrictions are being tightened, to have regular consultation. This is also done in the cities that have implemented a low emission zone for a longer time and have this plan, like Paris or Brussels. Communication was addressed. This is also important. There's a lot of negative press or uncertainties about low emission zones, so it's also important to have this positive narrative about the positive impacts, the health impacts, and also the effects on the positive financial effects if you reduce a negative health impacts. And what I've addressed is also important to have complementary measures which are targeted at vulnerable groups, like financial support measures I talked about for Brussels, for example, limited exemptions for some groups, but also have alternative modes of transportation to motorized vehicles, and to provide communication and also advice, because a lot of people are insecure. They are not really clear about what this implies. So this is something important as well.
Thank you, Sandra. So these are some extremely targeted interventions, and like we've heard throughout the entire webinar about having a very data-driven approach. So could you maybe shed light on what kind of specific data should our cities be collecting and analyzing to ensure that any fiscal incentive or any benefits of low emission zones are shared equitably across all segments of the society? And like you two brought up that, we have limited budgets, we have very few independent revenue sources, and we rely heavily on states and the national funding. So given these constraints, what is the data that we would have to capture to ensure that LEZ benefits are shared equitably?
Yeah, thanks. That's an important question. So it is important to have data on the real world emissions of vehicles, right? Where do we have hotspots of high transport related emissions? And the real driving emissions, that's important. And where are those hotspots in those cities, just to identify the right regions, and not only the hotspots, but also that overlap by where do the most vulnerable groups live, and to have the benefits in those areas who are most affected by transport-related emissions, but often not, using motorized transport modes themselves. So this data is crucial to and also to monitor throughout, to have the data to identify the right zones if you're starting with a smaller zone, but also for communication reasons. Because then you can clearly state and communicate the benefits of the zone when you regularly monitor real-world emissions of motorized vehicles. So that is something that is important, and also helping to create equitable low-emission zones and address those, the most vulnerable groups from the start.
Thank you very much, Sandra. So we are almost at time. I did have one last question to quickly wrap up, and then we will answer maybe one question from the audience. This is a question from our Lester, who is a very friendly LEZ guide. So I'll give each speaker 15 seconds to answer this. What is that one priority that you would like the Indian states or the national government to take to enable low emission zones? And I will start with Vivek and followed by Paran.
I think as Shashi was saying, legislation is key, finance is key, and start somewhere. Have boundary conditions and start somewhere. But I would say that money is important, and I say this because legislation, we have enough legislations. Cities will find a way. We need to just start somewhere. So, thank you.
Thank you. Parin?
Yeah, I would say just first, let's bring all the key stakeholders together. Let's let the government bring in all of them. Show them what exactly is low emission zone, what is possible, and clearly chart out a plan of action, which then city and other departments can start working on. So all get up towards implementation.
Great. Thank you. And Anju, over to you.
Anju is left. Yeah.
Oh, all right. We have Shri.
Not repeating what already said. So I think data in terms of understanding who is polluting, right? And putting some quantification to it, and especially within the vehicles also, who is polluting and who is likely to pollute. Really this understanding is required to have a more targeted interventions. I think this kind of data framework, instead of everybody putting their head to find this, probably something understanding at the national level will also help a lot for to understand. Yeah.
I think we all agree that data and targeted interventions is key. Sandra?
Yeah, I make it short: regulation, data, targeted intervention, and a good narrative. That's important as well.
Absolutely, communications is key. So with that, we do come to our questions from the audience. Unfortunately, we may have time to only take one. And this was a very interesting question from Amar Karan. And I'm wondering whether maybe Vivek or Parin would like to answer this question. So the question is, with so many initiatives being taken on ground with governments, I would like to understand from the speakers, do they see anything path-breaking really happening on ground, which is in real sense improving the quality of air, public outreach, and enhance understanding of their participation in mitigation actions and change in the way municipal resources are being allocated through budgets for projects that are sustainable and not counter-effective, increasing the emission sources like motorization, building flyovers, widening of roads? That was a very long question. Vivek or Parin, would you like to take that question?
I'll request Parin to take this, I think, because you guys are at a more advanced stage. So I'll request if you can take this, Parin.
Sure. I actually just typed in to answer that. But one, so one thing what in Pimpri Chinchwad the city is trying to do, this is not just only limited to low emission zones, but one, to create a sustainable mobility department where all the mobility initiatives come under one umbrella. So there is no different departments looking after it. There are no two different approaches. So there is one common approach, very aligned towards sustainable mobility. It also has participation towards bringing in people from expertise from local civil society organizations. So it is all together coming in for a common approach, and which is right. So that is one. Just to ensure that the investments are going in the direction where we want the objectives to be achieved. Second thing, this is my discussion with various of you. It's not that the low emission zone alone will reduce the air quality dramatically right from day one. It's also the other sectors which need to come together, also other sources also which need to be tackled to be able to see that change. So however, right at the start, expecting air quality to change dramatically, at least the reductions in the emissions from each of the sources is a good win, good start. And then definitely eventually moving on to seeing that our air quality also improves. Thanks, Kashmira.
Thank you, Paran. Unfortunately, we do not have time for any more questions. So I would like to conclude the panel discussion now. And once again, on behalf of ITDP and ICCT, I would like to thank everyone here on this panel, right from Mr. Shashi Verma, who's left, Anju Goyal, Parin, Dr. Sandra, Shri, and Dr. Vivek. Thank you very much for taking the time out and being a part of this discussion. Over to you, Siddhartha.
Thank you. Thank you, Kashmira. With that, we have come to the end of the third webinar and the Urbanlogue LEZ series. A big thank you to all our esteemed panelists and Kashmira for this in-depth, comprehensive, and indeed intriguing discussion. I'm sure it was helpful for all our viewers, and it would certainly help us in strategizing LEZ implementation going ahead. A big applause for all the efforts towards the LEZ Basics document, especially the technical and communications team at ITDP India and all the reviewers who have helped to put this document together. Thank you to our partner organizations, ICCT and Urban Research Foundation. And lastly, thank you to all the viewers and city agencies who are equally responsible in making this Urban Laws series interesting, insightful, and relevant to make a change towards a better tomorrow. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi, guys.
There are still